Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today's show is sponsored by Fred's Toilets. We have it all here at Fred's Toilets, from small, medium to bent. Contact us to receive a premium waste disposal kit. Fred's Toilets, we are number one in the number two business. In today's discussion, we will talk about Cape Independence. We are joined by Nicholas Woode-Smith from the Rational Standard, Chris Hattingh from the Free Market Foundation, and Martin van Staden, jurist and author. Welcome, guys.
Thank you for having us.
So, let me start by giving my views on Cape Independence. So I approach it more on a positive side. So a lot of people are pessimistic. They want to leave South Africa because they think it's going to go to hell. But like people like Frans Cronje, I think the future long-term prospects of South Africa are quite positive. My problem is just it's going to take a long while. It's probably going to take 50 or what years. There's going to be a lot of crap, internal ANC battles, and I'd rather have that divorce sooner and have a sort of Singapore, Hong Kong experience sooner than wait way long for it perhaps to happen 50 years from now. So that's sort of the way I approach Cape Independence. So yeah, Nicholas, who's the Deputy Minister of Transport?
I don't care.
No, I'm joking. No, just go ahead.
I think, didn't you ask that question in a previous interview? And I gave the same answer. I don't care. I've been supporting Cape Independence since high school, actually. It's probably one of my oldest political views. And I know you say that you come from approach it from a more positive angle, but in a way, they can also be pessimistic, that you're saying that, well, South Africa is going to be having all this conflict anyway, and you want to get away from it, which is just another side of the coin saying that the Cape would be a positive alternative. There's always going to be two sides of the same coin. We're never going to just say, oh, well, South Africa is terrible, so we just want to leave because the Cape is going to be less terrible. We want to leave because we think the Cape is going to be a positive alternative, as you say, the Hong Kong or Singapore experience. I would actually hope that we approach the Hong Kong and Singapore developmental models, but from a freer angle. Because as much as I do quite admire their developmental model, there is a little bit of authoritarianism there. And especially with Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew had a cult of personality that allowed him to get away with a lot of stuff that I don't think anyone in the Cape could do. So it's going to be a lot rougher, but in a way, I think also a lot freer as a result. There's a very broad topic though, so there's a lot of stuff to touch on. And I think the main reason, though, that I would say that I think Cape Independence is a desirable, but also in a way an inevitable conclusion, is that South Africa itself, I would say, is, like many nations around the world, it's an artificial construct. It's a bunch of nations and groups that were forced together into one political entity. And the type of political entity that they were forced into is one that cannot actually sustain this type of society. So you can get empires like the Ottomans, the British Empire, many empires that can function with a multicultural society that have groups that don't like each other. The Ottomans were able to do that for a long time. But the problem is that empires are designed to govern multicultural societies, when a nation, by definition, is a semi-ethnic construct. It's something where you have a unitary culture that is a political entity. And the big problem with South Africa is we use the saying that we have like 11 national languages as a point of pride, when that's actually should be an indication that we shouldn't be a unitary, centralized country. We should be, if anything, a confederacy, a federation with very good, with great local autonomy. But we also know that our ruling party would never go for that because it's completely anathema to their worldview. Can you imagine a communist saying that they will want to allow the Cape local autonomy? I think it's more impossible to think that the ANC would ever allow for federalism than we could say that the ANC will lose complete power and just allow the balkanization of South Africa. So I think it's an inevitability that I desire.
to Real News. The Constitutional Court has just delivered an extremely significant judgment, and now we go live to someone in the field for more feedback. John, can you hear us?
The Constitutional Court? Why am I in the field? Jesus fucking Christ, this company can't get anything right. 15 fucking years of my life, and now they're letting me go? Where is my pension? And you know what? This country's gone to fucking shit.
We appear to be having some technical difficulties, and we'll provide you with some feedback on the Constitutional Court's decision after the break.
Okay, Martin.
Yeah, so Nicholas has a far more sophisticated approach to this than I do. Don't let the colors of my hoodie create the impression that I am an unqualified pro-secessionist. This is very coincidental. I am very much a conditional supporter of Cape independence, or a conditional opponent of Cape independence, whatever the case may be. As I indicated in my previous discussion with you guys in Worldview, I consider myself a professional libertarian in every respect. So whether I support or oppose something depends entirely on how that will turn out for individual liberty. You also know that I am by no means a principled supporter of localism. I don't have this romanticization of, if the guy down the street is your governor, somehow everything will just be better. That's definitely not my approach to these things. But in our present South African context, I think it's very difficult to deny that a independent Cape is likelier to be better for liberty than a continued ANC dominance over the entire state is going to be for liberty. But even that is conditional. If, for instance, the Cape declares independence and immediately closes their borders and doesn't allow anyone from the rest of what used to be the United South African State to enter the Cape in search of freedom, then I would very much support the South African military reintegrating the Cape back into South Africa. I will definitely not accept an authoritarian closed border state that behaves in that fashion. But presumably, and I get this indication from its most ardent supporters and drivers now, is that the Cape would, if it's declared independent, would be a liberal democracy with a very big emphasis on economic freedom and personal liberty and the rule of law, and that gives me some optimism. But there's no guarantee of that. But yeah, I'm keenly looking at the movement. I think the idea of a referendum is self-defeating. I think that they should stop that. I think they should invest far more money in communicating the idea of Cape independence, of pushing for it on a popular level, make films, documentaries, music, whatever. Stop doing polling, stop doing a referendum studies or whatever. It's not helping. So yeah, I'm very interested in the topic. I would support it wholeheartedly if it turns out to be a movement of freedom, and I will oppose it wholeheartedly if it turns out to be a movement of oppression. And yeah, that's essentially my view. I'm very keen to get into a broader discussion about it.
Chris?
Thanks for asking me for me lastly, after my two colleagues have given such erudite views on it. I think I very much agree with Martin on the point of to what end. So not just independence for itself, or sort of independence qua independence, but what is it for? Is it to establish a certain different kind of dispensation and administration in the Western Cape, or is it simply, I guess, to be a power grab for the people who are pushing it, kind of thing? So that will ultimately be the moral standard by which I measure whether I'll support it or not. I will say, I mean, a great thing with an increasingly globalized world is the power of moving around, and by that I mean, if you move to a different place, you take your vote there. So by moving, you vote for living in a different place than you would where you were born, for example. And if Cape independence can happen in a good fashion, and one can clearly show what that administration can do for people's lives, quality of life, why you're freer there than you would be in other provinces or in the country that is, the Republic of South Africa, I think that's a great thing. On the other hand, with increasing globalization, if you have a one world government which just decides that all administrations are the same around the world, then it doesn't matter where you go, where you vote with your feet, as it were, because regardless, you're going to be under the whims of a government hub in Brussels or Geneva or Rio de Janeiro or wherever it happens to be. We shouldn't just presume that the US will be the one world government. Maybe, I don't know, but there are other actors around the world as well. So yeah, I think basically it's an inevitability, I think, given South Africa's history and its current pressures. I do not see realism on the part of the current ruling party in terms of fixing what is wrong and how much it has messed up. And in that way, it's in its own way, it will push Cape independence more. Almost in a way, it's making the strongest case for Cape independence. So I think it will happen. Let's see what sort of fashion it takes. And from there, then I'll decide whether to throw all of my moral and intellectual weight behind it or not.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that when the DA had the local elections, I think it was in 2016, when there was the local elections here, the motto, the slogan was vote for the DA to keep an ANC-EFF coalition out. And you can almost apply that nationally against the DA. Like vote for Western Cape independence to stop an ANC-EFF coalition. It's sort of a reverse flip that you can do on them. It's sort of a message that you can pull. But in terms of Martin saying immigration and the practicality of Cape independence, how would you respond to that, Nicholas? How would you do the immigration side? It's like the rest of South Africa getting, I don't know, citizenship in the Western Cape, or do they not?
So the big thing about this topic is it's one of the favorite topics by a lot of Cape secessionists who are pro it, because I'm going to admit it, there's a lot of ethnic conservatives who the reason they support Cape independence is because they have an ethnic idea of what the Cape should be and they want to keep out people they don't like. Fortunately, they are loud, but they're not actually a majority. The majority of Cape independence supporters are more liberal. They're doing it from a practical standpoint. They want to be the jewel of Africa. They want to be the Singapore of Africa, but still be allowed to eat chewing gum. But the thing about immigration, this is how I approach it from a political standpoint and from Martin's favorite word, pragmatic standpoint, is that people are going to have their stupid little ethnic things where they want to control borders and stop immigrants from coming in because they're scared of the boogeyman immigrant, even though economic facts and history and all the stuff shows that immigration is actually a boon to your society. And the thing about the Western Cape is that we're not going to be able to stop immigration from coming in. We have an unpoliceable border, and that's fine. And now a lot of people say that's a reason why the Cape independence shouldn't happen, is that we have an unpoliceable border. But by that definition, South Africa really shouldn't exist because South Africa's border is even more unpoliceable. In fact, if your entire support of an independent Cape gauges on which border is more policeable, the Western Cape border will be smaller, so it will be slightly more policeable. I think it's a silly way to gauge if you're going to support a country. I prefer Martin and Christo's their method why they want to support a Cape independence is that it would be a freer country that would be better for the people living in it. But I did want to say when Martin said that he would support the SANDF reintegrating the Western Cape back into South Africa, I wanted to ask which military, because we don't really have the capacity.
The paratroopers.
We have a few paratroopers where, actually, then I have to ask which plans. Are they going to revive Mango and they're going to drop the guys off Mango plans? So my pragmatic viewpoint when it comes to immigration and for the Cape Republic is, I don't care if a bunch of populists, because there's different Cape independence groups and some of them have different views. I don't see any of them as seriously reflecting what the country's going to look like. I think that we're still building a movement, and I think the culture is going to happen based on on the circumstances of how we secede. If it's amicable, I think we're going to have open borders, and it's basically going to be a nice free trade and stuff like that, especially if there's a balkanized South Africa where we can work together with the other states which have seceded. If it's less than amicable and we leave in a hail of gunfire.
And in what scenario do you see open borders? How do you see that playing out?
So the big thing is about the region is that because we've been a single country for so long, it's going to be very hard to stop people from wanting to travel over the border. And as much as a lot of people are like, no, they don't want South African refugees coming to into the Cape, that's completely unrealistic. We have trade with other people in the rest of South Africa, and also we've got families all over the place. It would be terrible for quality of life if we stopped trans-border travel in Southern Africa. I think that functionally it's going to be open borders because you can't police the borders because most borders are unpoliceable. And also, I think that because there's so many people who have their foot in the Western Cape and their foot in the rest of South Africa, it's going to be something where I think dual citizenship will be very common if both countries allow. I don't see why the Cape would not allow it. If it's a less than amicable divorce, I think the South African state might stop it. But I do believe that if one state in South Africa secedes, I think there's going to be others. I think that if the Cape secedes, I think there was going to be calls for Zulu secession. There's already some calls for Xhosa secession. And there's also calls for people who want to integrate parts of South Africa into Lesotho and Botswana. There's a lot of people in this country do not want to be a part of this country. And I think that all they really need is to realize that secession is something that's possible. Because the only thing that's really holding them back is they think it's an impossible idea, mostly because they don't read history and they don't realize that political borders change all the time.
Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Only to say, I wonder. I mean, it's interesting, the point around the free movement of people across borders, but also the matter of goods and services. Because if, let us say, the Cape became independent and it brings in a lot of foreign investment. Already now, Amazon is going to build their headquarters in Cape Town, their African headquarters, and the Cape isn't even independent as yet. I think that sort of thing, that sort of increased flow will present a very big temptation to Pretoria and Bloemfontein to bring in mercenaries or other help or something to reintegrate the Cape back into the fold. At the end of the day, for all of the lofty talk about politicians and bureaucrats serving the quote-unquote people, they're also in it. I mean, we've seen it, but they're in it for their own gain as well. And if they see a lot of revenue coming into the Cape, they're going to want that revenue flowing into their coffers as well. So I wonder how long they'll entertain that idea and what steps, how desperate they would become. I mean, even now we've had the different stages of the National Democratic Revolution. At the moment, there's talk about the national health insurance. That's a pot of money. We've got prescribed assets. That's a pot of money. So everywhere they're looking for pots of money. And I wonder whether an independent Cape would be independent for a few years and then one would see actual violent strife at the borders.
So you say almost like what happened in Scotland is that you can use the threat of independence to force more federalism, devolution of powers. I think that can. Martin, you've mentioned in the WorldView interview that you would prefer, if I remember correctly, a more federalism approach than Cape independence. How do you see that actually working? Because as far as I understand, you need like 75% of the votes in Parliament to get that through the Constitution. So isn't that even more difficult than Cape independence?
No, look, so I know Phil Craig has now said multiple times that federalism is more difficult than national independence. I absolutely do not buy that one little bit. I'm not saying federalism would be easy by any means, but when you're talking about breaking away a part of a state, then you are effectively talking about if you plan to do it at any cost.
Let me just clarify. I'm not saying it's going to be hell, perhaps, if Cape independence, but it's going to be more likely to happen than federalism. That's what I mean.
I know, yeah. So no, I still don't believe that. I think federalism is exceedingly difficult to attain. But if the Cape independence movement itself really leads to a groundswell, if there's clear pressure for it and a developing not a majority necessarily, but a very strong portion of the population of the Western Cape says we want Cape independence and we're going to push for it, then you make federalism extremely likely. You make it very, very likely. It doesn't matter if 100% of the Cape believes that the state should be independent. It's still going to be difficult to achieve that because of, I mean, take your pick. Koeberg is a South African power station in the Cape. It's our only nuclear power station. The Western Cape contributes, I believe, the second largest portion of revenue to the South African state. There are multiple reasons that the ANC government would fight tooth and nail to keep the Cape as part of South Africa, and we need to be aware of that. But if you go to the ANC and you say, listen, we now have a massive portion of people who are now insisting on independence, I can almost guarantee the ANC would say, wow, okay, this is a problem for us. Let's talk about a compromise. And within the framework of that compromise, I think we have very, very real constitutional avenues towards a federalist dispensation. It would be ideal for us to amend the constitution. It would only be a 2/3 majority necessary to change the provincial setup entirely, to make it far more constitutionally federal. But even without amending the constitution, there are various provisions, mostly that relate to local government, that say things like if a local government can do something better than a higher level of government, then it must be able to do so. So that is one avenue to sneak in federalism under our current constitutional dispensation, and all you need for that is ordinary national legislation defining a new system of local government, which can simply be, you can define the Western Cape or a portion of it as a local government. That's not impossible. So there are avenues to achieve a federal devolution of power in South Africa. And I think that at the end of the day is going to be far more likely than achieving Cape independence. And even if Cape independence remains the ultimate goal, if you can achieve federal devolution in the meantime, then it's fewer steps to ultimate independence in the future if you still want to push for that. So I think that's just a realist note from my side, in that it is going to be easier to attain federal devolution, and then you are going to have to compromise and say Koeberg will still feed into the national grid. People from the rest of South Africa can still come into the Cape freely. They may not be able to vote in Cape elections, but they can still be present and work here and live here. The Cape will still pay a very large amount of its national revenue to the ANC government. I mean, this is something that I fear a lot of people are going to have to make peace with, and that is that the Cape isn't going to come out of this financially totally free to spend the large amount of money that Cape taxpayers give to the fiscus. A lot of that is going to have to be reinvested into South Africa if we want Cape independence or Cape devolution to be a peaceful process. You're gonna have to give something in exchange for getting the autonomy or even the independence. It's not gonna be a one-sided, hey, the people have spoken and said they want to be independent and we're leaving. That's simply not a realist approach to how a government in general, but specifically an African government that is very much poised to control as much power as it possibly can. That's simply not how it's going to work in reality. Now, if you want to fight your way out, that changes things. If you have a good financial backer who is going to buy your uniforms and your equipment and your tanks and your bombs, then maybe there's an argument for that. But if you want to negotiate your way out, you want to talk your way out, you want to compromise your way out, then you're still going to end up paying a lot of money into South Africa, feeding a lot of energy back. The South African Navy isn't going to give up Simonstown anytime soon. So there's a lot of compromised things that we need to talk about there. And I think devolution in general is just going to be the path of least resistance, at least for now, for the first step. And then in the future, we can, if devolution doesn't work, then of course you can circle back to independence.
So, Nicholas, I've heard that, for example, Helen Zille and John Steenhuisen made very similar arguments to this, that It looks like this is the sort of comeback to the Cape Independence question, is that if you're going to do it, you're going to have to pay all these taxes. For Kuberg, whatever, you don't want to do that. But I'm also thinking, I mean, we're now paying for state capture and whatnot, all the crap that the ANC has stolen and whatnot. And it's almost like, can it even be, well, I mean, it's an open question if we really have to pay it. I mean, but yeah, even if we have to pay it, could it be less than what we're paying right now for the incompetencies of the ANC?
The thing is that about federalism is that people are considering it as a form of a loss for Cape Independence, but I would say no. If you actually note by what Martin said early on in his point, was he says that while we're developing a movement for independence, it can be used as a bargaining chip to gain federalism and increase local autonomy. And a lot of people are making this argument, like Zilla and Steenhuisen, that we're still going to have to pay all these expenses, but we're already paying those expenses. So the worst thing that could happen with federalism or increased local autonomy, or maybe even a deal where we become independent, but we still have to pay them a ransom sort of, is we're still paying them the amount that we're paying them anyway, but we have political independence, and we have the independence to pass policies that help free our people and also just help generate economic growth. And also, if we have, if we're able to retain more of our tax income, we're going to be paying less. So the kind of that argument is effectively saying, well, we're still going to be paying 75% of the money that we're paying rather than 100%, but it's not 0%, so we shouldn't even try. I think you must always go for these steps. I'm perfectly fine with compromise. And my big idea is, and I mentioned this in my roadmap to liberty, which about Cape Independence on the Rational Standard. I think it's called Cape Independence Roadmap to Liberty. And it's about the steps that I believe need to be taken in order to build the movement and then gain independence. And I talk about that achieving local autonomy and using the Cape Independence movement as a bargaining chip is one of the steps. I don't think that you should just like go from what we have now and just immediately declare independence. You need to have that bargaining where you say, dudes, if you don't want to lose the Western Cape, you're going to have to give us some dispensation, and we're going to have to negotiate. And there's two options there. Either they make concessions and we win because we're gaining a foothold, and things are getting better. They might not be what we wanted completely, but we're getting there. And I think some gains are better than no gains. Or they reject us, and all that does is just legitimize the independence movement more by showing that there are souls who are unwilling to compromise. And that also looks very good to foreign supporters who, if things do have to get violent, you're going to need foreign support. And the best thing to do to gain foreign supporters is to show that there's an authoritarian government who's unwilling to compromise with local independence movements.
Yeah, Chris, I know you're also I know you're a fan of Ayn Rand. How do you see this also, I don't know, coming into the Cape Independence question? Do you see, I've read some of Ayn Rand, but did she also believe in a devolvement of powers? And would she have supported such an idea of Cape Independence?
I'm going to get excommunicated from the objectivist movement because I'm going to pretend to say what Rand would have said. But I mean, I would imagine, if you look at the US independence in the war against Britain, I mean, that was a war to establish what they saw as a more moral and just form of government, not beholden to a foreign monarch. That sort of idea, whether that experiment, I mean, it's been successful to some extent and it's been showing its cracks, unfortunately, to other extents. But I think one should be quite optimistic about what the US has managed with its moral and constitutional framework up until this point. So to Cape Independence, I think it goes back to, the standard by which you're measuring it. So Rand, with anything, it wouldn't just be this thing is good or this thing is bad without a context. It's not just it's not isolated from factors around it. So what would be the end goal of Cape Independence if it is to establish a more liberty-friendly enclave or gulch, to use a phrase from Atlas Shrugged, then yes, I think she would very much be in favor of this sort of thing. It's always about, I think, from the objectivist framework, the important thing is that the form of government that is established is an individual rights respecting government. That's the most important thing. From there, other things can flow out of it. You can have questions about how to do taxation and that kind of thing. I mean, for Rand, government is a necessary good, but it should be conceived in the right way. It's not to say that there should be no government or anything like that, but it should be conceived in the right way. And if you can somehow manage to do that in the context of Cape independence, I think there would be serious moral weight behind it. Whether you can, I guess the other question is, can you effectively deal with the contending forces within the Cape independence movement? Maybe can there be a compromise between them? Will a more authoritarian streak win out? Will a more conservative streak win out? Will a more liberal streak win out? That again becomes a point further down the line. But in principle, I would say objectivism, especially when it comes to the conceiving of government, if you can devolve powers and make the government more accountable to the people, where they can continue to shape the society in an individual rights flourishing way, then yes, I think objectivism would support that kind of thing.
What do you think? Because I've read Atlas Shrugged, and I know in the end there's the scene where she goes to this sort of utopia, anarchic place where she meets, I think, her boyfriend, and she has to make this vow in this new country. I can't remember that vow.
Oh, with Dagny, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of something like that, adding to, I don't know, a Western Cape or a new country? I know, for example, in the United States, you have to make this entire pledge of allegiance if you want to become a citizen. What do you think of a sort of I don't know, indoctrination is a strong word, but a sort of a procedure, a pledge that you have to make in a new Western Cape? I vow to be, I don't know, a capitalist or whatever.
Hey, in that case, if that's the one provision, then I think that'd be great.
I know, and you pay, if you're a socialist, we pay for you to go to a socialist country.
I think, look, my concern with pledges of allegiance, and we're inevitably going to talk about the US here because a lot of our pop culture is so informed by it, but I find that sort of thing where kids, for example, have to say the Pledge of Allegiance in high school deeply concerning and worrying. I think that very much dilutes the whole experiment in and of itself, where the state portends to give value judgments and value assessments to kids, and they have to sort of do it by rote and stand up and say it every morning kind of thing. That, to me, in a one way, it opens the door to abuses and corruption, and another way, it just dilutes the sort of idea of liberty in and of itself. I think if you get an independent Cape, obviously one would hope that it has a very strong and very strong individual rights respecting constitution. So by signing onto that constitution, you already sign some sort of pledge. I don't like the word pledge, but in that way, you then already support what the Cape stands for, what the ideas are behind it. I mean, Rand, for example, said that the US Constitution was the only moral document for government behavior ever conceived in history, because it was the only one that placed individual rights at the center up until that point. Before that, it was simply a case of divine right of kings and stuff like that, and by rule by force kind of thing. So if you have the right things in place, then I think you can have that sort of pledge or something, but I don't think it should become a case of I swear allegiance to the premier of the independent Western Cape, Nicholas Woode-Smith kind of thing. That to me would be concerning.
I'm fine with that. I don't think we should be too hasty.
Or just Nicholas Woode-Smith in general.
Yeah, true. Yeah, actually, maybe the founding father. Yeah.
Martin, anything to add, perhaps, to Nicholas' point that we're paying at the moment too much in comparison to what we will pay if we secede?
Yeah, no, I mean he's absolutely correct. You're not. My point was that you're not going to get away from paying something. South Africa and the Cape, even before South Africa became a union in 1910, was integrated. Foreign writers, when they wrote about South Africa in the 1800s, they wrote about South Africa. There was no country called South Africa, but they wrote about South Africa, and that referred to the Cape Colony, the Natal Colony, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal Republic. So these four regions have, and Rhodesia was also included. These regions were always regarded as a unit in some way or another, even though they were politically independent. That is not going to come to an end anytime soon, even if the Cape and all other provinces declare independence. This will still remain an economic unit to a large extent. It will remain an infrastructure unit. It will remain a cultural unit. I think the South African region is by far the most westernized part of Africa, for instance. So there's very much a cultural unity here. So you're gonna pay something. You're never gonna have a total sovereign, absolute independence if you operate in this area. So why not pay something, but then get something out of it as well? So I agree completely with Nicholas. You need devolution first. You're still gonna pay, and if you get independence, you're still gonna pay, but you're at least getting something to get away from the nonsensical transformationism, the employment equity and affirmative action, and bloody hell from expropriation without compensation. I mean, that should be the most terrifying thing to people in the Cape and in South Africa in general, and to me, in my mind at least. That creates a sense of urgency around Cape devolution or Cape independence. It needs to happen soon before people start expropriating private property and bringing our society collapsing down on itself. So yeah, you'll get policy independence at the very least, and I think that's of fundamental importance. And as to what Chris said, yeah, I agree. There shouldn't be any explicit pledges necessarily, although, and I don't know to what extent anyone agrees with me on this, I do think that when it comes to the amount of political pull you have in society, then there should be some kind of sacrifice that you make, or some kind of call it a pledge that you make, so I accept that there is universal franchise, and everyone who is bound by the law that a parliament creates must have a say in how that parliament is elected. But I do think that there should be different levels of franchise, if I can put it that way. And if you want to climb that ladder, then I do think, for instance, you should be vetted maybe by a court of law that says this person hasn't done anything to contravene the constitutional principles of our society, and therefore their vote now weighs more. Now, I know Germany today has something like this. I don't know the details, but they do very much monitor and vet organizations and citizens to see if they're being Nazis or communists, and if they are, then no, you get disbanded and whatever. I think something like that is necessary, and I would recommend for an autonomous or an independent Cape that its constitution not simply be the current conception of universal franchise. I think democracy has proven to be problematic if it's regarded as uninhibited. I think far stronger inhibitors must be placed on democracy. Don't get rid of the idea, of course not, but there must be strong inhibitors, and I think the Cape is a prime example of it, because the Cape liberal tradition is very much associated with what was then called qualified franchise, but all franchise is qualified, so it's actually a meaningless term. But I would say that the Cape political elite, or whatever we want to call them, should rediscover the Cape liberal tradition and look into the qualified franchise idea, or the, let's call it, more substantive franchise idea, in how they designed their constitution, and that would make up for the lack of a pledge, for instance, and make sure that only those who truly have skin in the game in this polity really get to have a bigger say. I mean, the principle of he who pays says, I think, is a very much ignored principle that needs its time to shine again. And I think that will make up for call it indoctrination, which we certainly don't want. I don't want the Cape to be a totally homogeneous society ideologically, but when it comes to political decision making, there needs to be substantive limits on the passions of populism that run through societies. And I think in Africa, and I don't care if it's an independent Cape, which is the jewel of Africa, I think as a general principle, if you're in Africa, your political system needs to be designed with far more limits on power and far more limits on call it democracy than anywhere else, because unfortunately Africa has shown itself to be quite irresponsible, quite reckless in all of its history, even the colonial period, when it comes to respecting liberty and respecting property rights. I think Africa has I don't know if it's a curse or something, but there's something wrong here, and we just can't afford to be less to be too open about how we design our systems. There needs to be strong constitutional limits, far stronger than what we've seen elsewhere in the world, I would say.
Yeah, well, I think all third world countries pretty much have that problem. But in terms of practicality, how we achieve Cape independence, Nicholas, how do you see that actually? How do we do it? Right? What is the best way to do it? And to add to that, Frans Cronje, for example, has said that he thinks it's very unlikely, but he said that if the Zulu kingdom secedes, then I don't know what's the correct phrase he used, but now it's actually possible. He says if they go, yeah. And Davie Rood has said that, I mean, just declare independence. I mean, the state is so incompetent, they won't be able to do anything. And to add to that, it's an interesting idea I've had, that 3-1, I mean, there's a common statistic thrown about that private security outnumber the police, I think 3-1. So, I mean, what happens if a person just bought a lot of private security and just seized all the key government institutions in the Western Cape? Just throwing it out there, but I mean, yeah, what do you see as the best way to do it?
So before I go into that, I quickly just want to respond to Martin, if I may.
Sure.
So I completely agree with the stricter qualified franchise idea. The problem is that, can you imagine the rest of the world allowing that to happen? It's this idea that you have to have this pure, everyone over the age of 18 is allowed to vote regardless. It's more of a foreign policy issue than anything else. I would love to be the merchant republic of the Cape, where owning property is actually qualifies you to vote, but I don't think anyone would let it happen. Now, onto the practicality. So there's two real roadmaps. There's the peaceful negotiations, and then there's the violent one. We don't really know, and they can mix. In general, both of them start with building manpower. You have to have a movement behind you that's willing to back up whatever strategy you have to do and whatever circumstances. You need support. And the thing is, as we can see from the decolonization movements in Africa, you don't actually need the majority of a country to secede. In most places that split off from the British Empire, it was a small minority, often not even locals, Russian-backed terrorists who basically seceded. We don't need a majority in the Cape to actually secede. You just have to have a loud elite minority that's able to lead it, and you have to have enough manpower to actually, if it's peaceful, make it look like it's a large movement and fill each peaceful role of being a negotiator or being a flag waver at a protest. And if it's violent, you need enough people to hold guns. Now, so first you need a movement, you need manpower. And this is the problems a lot of people forget. It's a big problem in South Africa that people think they can skip from having an idea and then they win. You have to build up that movement first, and that's essential. And that's what we're still doing. And I see a lot of people trying to skip with the polling and the referendum stuff, which I agree with, Martin. I hate the idea. I've been trying to argue with Phil Craig and the Cape Party and all of them, and by abandoning the stupid referendum idea and focusing on building a movement. After you have a movement, you use that as a bargaining chip to start negotiating. So first you use that to negotiate with foreign powers to get their support.
So you have the movement. How do you prove to the government that you, for example, it's big or whatnot, like that they listen to you?
Okay, so it's initially, let's look at the actual anti-apartheid things. Well, now the anti-apartheid movement, it's very hard to actually gauge how many people were truly a part of the liberation movements. But what they did is they had these massive demonstrations where they went out on the streets, they showed their colors, they showed their branding effectively. It's like a business. You show your branding and people start recognizing that. And it starts coming up that people start thinking these colors mean Cape Independence. And every single time they see it, they click something in their brain that makes it seem more prevalent and stronger.
Yeah, if I
You
may
could-
interject,
Yes.
just to say it becomes self-evident. I mean, you don't have to show X amount here and X amount there. When every second article in the Cape newspaper is about independence, when every car has a little independence flag hanging out of it, the government will simply know we have a groundswell happening here and we need to address that. So you don't have to say we have this number. It must become self-evident, and if it's not self-evident, it means you're not yet where you need to be.
Exactly. And this is one of the big problems that I have with polling as well. And I think Martin and I share exactly our views on polling there, is it's unnecessary. The numbers you need to show are not a specific digit. It's just a feeling. Now, after you have those are initially your resources. So they flow into other things. But then you start using it as a bargaining chip, firstly, to get support from local organizations. You're going to need support from local corporations, local other civic organizations, political parties, anything. Also from foreign governments and foreign political parties. That's very important. That's something the ANC did extremely well. That even though they were not the primary liberation movement in South Africa, they became the primary liberation movement because they convinced the world that they were. So that's something that a Cape Independence organization has to do. And I know that the Cape Independence Advocacy Group has been doing that to a degree. And they have been talking to foreign political parties, foreign secessionist movements, which are actually very valuable because those are initially your first friends are other secessionist movements. And that's very good, especially if you ally with one that's about to secede, then you immediately have a new friend who's now recognized by the international community. But it's that recognition that you really need. There's something called the Montevideo Convention, which basically defines, it's only recognized in a few countries, but it's a general idea of what constitutes a legal country. And possibly the most important aspect of that is you need foreign recognition. People just have to recognize that you are an independent country. So it's better to actually get that support first before you actually secede, because it makes things a lot easier. After you have all that, you have your more bargaining chips, and then you can start going to the table with your overlord. You can start going to the table with the ANC government and negotiating with them from a point of power, using your manpower and using your foreign support and your local support to say that we have all these things that can threaten you. Let's negotiate for concessions. And the big thing is that you don't just declare independence overnight unless there's a crisis in the country where you know you can get away with it. Now, if there's a huge civil war and you kind of need to pull out and you know that the government's not going to be able to stop you, do it. But you can't plan for those. Those things are watershed, black swan events. But let's say that South Africa never has a crisis. Let's be optimistic and say South Africa remains a perfectly unstable stable country for decades. We'll go to the negotiating table and we use our bargaining chips to try to get our concessions. If they give us concessions, great. We then take advantage of those concessions and keep building the movement, saying, look, guys, with all we've gotten these concessions, it means that we can start demanding more. And you start using that to start demanding more and more, because if they give us a finger, we can take the arm. And on the other side, if they reject the concessions, that will make people angry, and that will prove to the international community that we are living under an authoritarian regime that does not care about its population and does not care about their wishes, which will justify our self-determination. So it's actually a win-win there. But before you do that, you have to get those bargaining chips. You have to get the keys to power. And after that, it's basically just a case of just being irritating and negotiating with them a lot, or waiting for a black swan event.
Okay, Chris, do you want to add anything?
I just want to say, Cape Independence is going to happen, and then I want to ask Nicholas, how is he going to deal with the people who jog on Sea Point every day who want to be led by Cyril?
Oh God. So the three Karens who support him, they can start their little fan club and they can appoint him as their fan club president.
But that didn't last long. I mean, that just lasted while the Ramaphosa was there. Nobody wants to jog with him now.
Yeah. Sadly,
I think
there
a lot
are
of
quite
people
few.
still do. I think, especially now that he is doing something with corruption, I think there'll be a groundswell of support for the ANC again.
So I will say that the NC are perfectly allowed, I would say, unless they have explicitly, because I do agree with Martin's idea of constitution restricting what parties are allowed to campaign for. But if the NC wants to start a lighter form of their socialist policies, but without the socialism in the Cape Republic, I'm not going to stop them. Maybe Cyril can apply for citizenship and get it, and he can run for president. And maybe maybe he might get a parliament seat or whatever equivalent we have. He can be on the Merchants Council. Because apparently he's supposed to be this great businessman who shoots miners, children and the people who mine the ground. Maybe the NC might be elected, but I really doubt that. And this is a big thing where people get afraid. They're saying, oh no, we might get taken over by another power. The worst thing that can happen, if you look at the history of the Cape, is that we'll just have a DA government, which is terrible. I hate the idea. But it's still better than the ANC government. And I do think that without the threat of an ANC or EFF, I think that a lot of people will realize how incompetent and how subpar and milky the DA are, and start getting better alternatives and will start being more radically free market. I think that the worst party will end up having is probably some colored nationalists, but I don't think that I don't think they will be the majority. I think that if anything, there might be a loud coalition partner that you just concede and say, oh, you can have this public holiday. And then, and that might be the extent of it.
Donald, if I may, I just have a question to put to the three of you.
Sure.
So, I mean, for me, part of my work is writing on and researching government policies and commenting on it. And, I should be thankful that I live in the country where the government has messed up as much as it has. Otherwise, I might have to work in academia or something, God forbid. But one thing that I think people don't appreciate a lot is, and that I'm thankful for, is that I'd much rather have an inefficient and corrupt communist than an efficient, even centrist, middle of the road person in charge, bureaucrat, something like that in charge of the government and the levers of power, because they'd be a lot better at cracking down on my liberties than an inefficient communist. So let's say we get Cape independence and, for example, a more busybody Democratic Alliance gets elected, then they have more control over their fiefdom. How do you deal with that kind of situation? Do you then have further breakaways and further independence movements? I mean, maybe Sea Point will break away at some point. I don't know. But what do you guys think of that?
I think that I see your point, and I agree that it is a problem. But as I said, I think that if the DA does not have the ANC or the EFF boogeyman to keep winning them elections, I think there will be good competition that will put them in their place. I also think that if you look at the DA's local policies and their internal politics, the Western Cape DA is a lot more liberal and libertarian than the national DA. All of the general bad things in the DA come from the national DA caucuses. The Western Cape DA, very free market, very libertarian. If you look at people like Tammy Jackson, she's actually quite representative of the libertarians that we have in the local DA. And I think that's a good thing. I think the DA would actually split up. Now, I obviously I'm not going to put money on it, mostly because I don't think the bet will ever come to fruition. But I do think that if there is a secession, the DA will split up, unless they end up becoming the Cape Party. If they become the Cape Secessionist Party, it may change, but they're going to have to change their policies drastically. And I think that if they ever did become a secessionist party, they will not be the current DA that we have. It'll be very fascinating to see what type of policies they would support under those circumstances.
Yeah, I would add to that, the scenario in which I see the DA becoming a secession party is if they continue to struggle nationally. And with the pressure of the Western Cape, they feel that that's the only way to go. But in terms of, I see it all, the politics in the Western Cape can only be better. All of this is relative, but it can only be better because even now you can see, like Nicholas has said, the average quality and the ideology of the politicians here are far more right-leaning than nationally. And I believe that the Western Cape is basically just, I don't know, 20, 30 years ahead of the national sphere. And that's the situation that the ANC is currently in is probably what the ANC is going to be 20, 30 years from now. I mean, the ANC basically in the Western Cape is imploding. They couldn't basically elect a leader last time around. So I see that's basically what's going to happen nationally as well. So yeah, we're just in a better situation here in Western Cape than nationally. We can have problems, but it's most likely not going to be big as the national situation in the future.
Yeah, so my view on that is far less. So my issue with the theory of democracy, especially as it comes from the British tradition, is that from the start they said we don't need, and this is the British constitutional tradition as well. We don't need these strong limits on government because the people will fundamentally vote their vote to limit government. There won't be high taxes because people don't like taxes, so they'll vote against higher taxes. And this is fundamentally also the Grundnorm that went into the unification of South Africa. People like Jan Smuts and John Xavier Merriman made these arguments and said we don't need a rigid constitution because no one is going to vote for big centralized government. Don't be ridiculous. It's all fine. We have democracy. So what's there to worry about? I have very little faith in democracy, and I think the new South African experiment is just a further proof. I think the old South African experiment was already conclusive proof, but now the new South African experiment is more proof that democracy is only as good insofar as it is very strictly limited. So my answer to Chris's question is to say that there needs to be a very strong constitution set in place, and not just nice text. I know a lot of people say, yeah, if the people aren't constitutionalist, then it won't work, and that's absolutely true. So I'm not just saying there needs to be nice, strictly defined rights and so on, and government may not do this and government may not do that. It needs to be about a constitution establishing institutions, and these institutions need to be pitted against one another from the very start. The internal Cape divisions, call them districts or provinces of the Cape or whatever, need to have a very real incentive to be opposed to the national Cape government. The legislature in the Cape needs to have a very real and constitutionally defined and encouraged incentive to be opposed to the executive. Independent executive institutions need to have an incentive and an institutional incentive to be opposed to each other. That's something that is absolutely totally lacking in South Africa because we have something called cooperative governance, which is all about all organs of state must pull in the same direction. That's poison to constitutionalism. That is absolute poison. And if the Cape, whether it goes the route of autonomy or of independence, in either case, there needs to be institutions that, by their very nature, are opposed to each other, where you put someone in power, a totally anti-libertarian, anti-democrat, authoritarian, needs to want to defend his domain against other government institutions to such an extent that he, in practice, turns out to be the best limiting factor to government. That is how you make a constitutional success, and that is what the Cape, if it wants to be a free society, will need to do. Is it will need to have these institutions, have more than 2 houses of parliament, have 5. Have more than a single head of government, like a single prime minister, have a rotating prime minister like the Swiss have. Stuff like that needs to be at the very forefront of the Cape system of government.
Put term limits on bureaucrats.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, more of that.
Because that's one thing I don't understand. I mean, these people are there like for 25 years. Why? I mean, but also to add to that, one ugly thing I see possibly in the Western Cape is, Nicholas also mentioned, is sort of a colored nationalist party that goes heavy against immigration, because it's sort of an underrated statistic in South Africa how many South Africans do not view immigrants in a favorable light. And I mean, I don't know to how many colored people you've spoken, but in general, how to put this delicately, they're not so fond of their darker brethren. Like that's the worst case scenario. yeah, it can get ugly in that sense. But still, I don't think that's highly likely.
I think they're a violent, loud minority, but they're not actually. But if you look at the support on the ground, they're quite small. They haven't even been able to get that much into the news. I know about them because I pay attention to small little political movements, and I know some people have spoken to the people on them. But in general, the main problem in the Western Cape, as it's going to be, which it is now, and it's going to be for quite a while, is gangsterism, which, if anything, we need secession or federalism in order to have the local policies to address that. And I think that that's going to be that is actually separate from secession. That's something which is it's its own problem. I don't even think you can blame the NC for causing it. You can blame them for preventing the solutions for it, though.
Yeah.
I think we also shouldn't look past. I know the Cape Colored Congress is a bit authoritarian, but there is definitely a white faction, call it, that's also quite racist, I would say, which tends to poison what I think is the mass liberal democratic mentality of the Cape independence movement, and this is also something that must be borne in mind, maybe worked against, but also just acknowledge that when the media says, yeah, but this thing about white supremacy, there's a grain of truth there. It doesn't define the movement, but there's a grain of truth there that it can only do the Cape independence movement well to say, yes, there are these clowns and they have no pull, their influence is very limited, and we want nothing to do with their policy prescription. So that's just something that I think should be borne in mind.
Yeah, it's annoying. I mean, these sites, these Cape independent sites where they have like pictures and posters of like black people marching, and it's like titles like "We have to get away from this. We have to march away from this." So I mean that jeopardizes everything. But I mean, yeah, I mean this is about been an hour. Do you guys want to add or plug anything? Nicholas, let's start with you.
I would actually like to plug something which I'm only marginally involved in, just as I support them and I just talk with Phil Craig quite a lot. But the Cape Independence Advocacy Group is the only Cape Independence organization which I actually take seriously. They actively reject the white supremacist wackos. I think they're very pragmatic in the good sense. And I think they're very professional. I think they have some problems where they're obsessed with polling and referendums, but compared with the other groups, that's a small problem. From the other plug, my personal plug is remember to read the Rational Standard for Cape Classical Liberal and also Cape Independence News. We are one of the few media houses that will almost always publish pro-Cape Independence stuff. Well, within reason. We haven't received anything we've had to reject yet. And that's all the relevant plugs from me.
Chris?
Thank you, Donald, and to my fellow panelists. Always a great discussion and spending time with you guys trying to think through these issues. To the viewers and listeners, if you're interested to learn more about the Free Market Foundation, you can go to www.freemarketfoundation.com for all of our articles, publications, research. And you can also consider donating to support the foundation if you're able to do so. And you can find all of our podcasts on YouTube, Free Market Foundation, and also across audio platforms such as Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Just search for the Free Marketeers. Thanks.
Martin?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I always enjoy discussing political theory like this. So my major plug is my own website. That's martinvanstaden.com. It's all one word. Yeah, you'll find my articles there. You'll find all the different organizations that I'm involved with on there. You'll also find that I've been on WorldView before, so I would encourage you to look at that extended interview where we get into some of my other ideas around geopolitics and libertarianism and law in South Africa. I'm a jurist fundamentally, so have a look at that. But also keep your eyes out on the Cato Journal for, I believe, the September edition. of the Cato Institute, where I have written a journal article, an academic article on Cape independence, and more specifically on devolution of power within the Republic of South Africa, with the Cape as the case study. I think this is the first time that the modern Cape independence movement appears in academic literature, so I'm very excited about that. So keep your eyes out on that. I believe it's open access. You can just Google Cato Journal in September, and then you will find the article there. And I hope that gets at least an academic discussion going about the merits and demerits of devolution in South Africa, and maybe even Cape independence. So yeah, first port of call, martinvanstaden.com. Thanks, Donald.
Sure. Yeah, I'd also like to plug something, but I mean, it's over there. I'll plug it in afterwards. Yeah, electricity joke. But yeah, this has been WorldView. Thanks for watching. Until the next WorldView.